Presidential historian Dr. Allan Lichtman is with us right now. Dr. Lichtman, thank you for being here.
Certainly. Happy to be with you.
So in terms of, a lot of people are going to have an opinion, but this is the day that people put their opinions aside, their critique aside, and they look back on what a man or, in this case, a president contributed to humanity. What would you say is President Jimmy Carter's greatest accomplishment?
Donald Trump claims to have the support of evangelical Christians, but Jimmy Carter lived the life of an evangelical Christian in the best sense of the term. He was our most devout president. And while it's easy to focus on his post-presidency, which is surely the greatest post-presidency in the history of the country, as has been already shown, Habitat for Humanity, monitoring elections, eliminating the scourge of horrible diseases in Africa, working for peace. But he did have some extraordinary accomplishments as president, which tend to be overshadowed, of course, by the economic troubles, the stagflation, the high inflation and unemployment, and the tragedy of the Iran hostage crisis. But let's not forget the extraordinary Camp David Accords, the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, the establishment of the Departments of Energy and Education, the SALT II Treaty, the Panama Canal Treaties, the deregulation. We shouldn't forget that there were accomplishments in a mixed presidency. I also have a personal story to tell, which
please.
I think reveals something about Jimmy Carter that nobody knows.
I love that stuff. Give us the stuff that no one knows.
Nobody knows this story, I think.
All right.
In 1979, I was a serious runner, and I was running in the Catoctin Mountain 10K race right near the presidential retreat of Camp David. And I look to my left, and I see a few yards away from me is this skinny, pale guy who looks like he's in his underwear. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that's President Jimmy Carter is going to run this race. Maybe I can run with him, but I decided, no, I want to win the race. I didn't. I ran my own race. That was the race in which Jimmy Carter was supposedly notorious for collapsing, which wasn't a huge surprise. It's the toughest of all 10K races. It's 5K down and 5K up. And that collapse was jumped on by the press as kind of emblematic of a collapsing presidency. But here's the story behind the story. After the race, we have this gathering when they give awards to those who did well in the race. And guess who shows up with no fanfare, no press, no publicity? Jimmy Carter, and gives us this incredible, amazing, uplifting kind of story. That got buried. Nobody knows this, but that is far more emblematic of the kind of person Jimmy Carter was than his collapse in the race. And I want to share that story with the world.
Well, that's lovely, and I'm glad you shared it here first on News Nation. I think about this because as we watch people, every person can present a lesson to us. So looking at his humanity and looking at how he could show up with no fanfare, what do you think it was about him? I mean, you could take statistics and maybe tell me what science has said, but in your gut, Allan, what do you think it was about him that allowed him to ascend to the highest office in the land and yet still relate to everyday mom and pops, Joe Schmo, your neighbor, my neighbor, and actually connect?
First of all, I think it was his Christian faith. I think he represented the best of the teachings of Jesus, not this hostile, negative teaching, but the love for ordinary people, the love for truth, the belief in taking care of the sojourner and taking care of the poor. He lived that faith. And unlike so many politicians today, I'm not going to name names, he didn't live just for himself. He lived for the world. He lived for others. And that is the greatest legacy of Jimmy Carter, and one we really can take to heart today. If we really followed the legacy of Jimmy Carter, just didn't give it lip service, the day he died or the day after he died, maybe that could cast at least a small light on a very different kind of less toxic, more positive kind of politics that Jimmy Carter represented throughout his life, not just in the 4 years of his presidency.
Right. And he obviously, I mean, it was something that he spoke about often, his faith. In fact, Time magazine called 1976 the year of the evangelical. He was very vocal throughout his political career, his personal life, and then following with those Sunday school classes where hundreds of people would show up if he was teaching, and he'd sometimes surprise people. We're at a time when God is being brought up and when faith is being talked about much more in media, including, the fact that people called the assassination attempt on President Trump a miracle, that God saved his life. Different people who have spoken out about their faith. RFK Jr. praying for being able to help children. Do you think that that's one lesson that politicians could learn from Jimmy Carter, to actually embrace a faith life and don't think that it is at conflict or at odds with their aspirations?
It's not only not in conflict with their aspirations. The kind of faith that Jimmy Carter represented, caring for others, compassionate, a humanitarian, really should be a guidance for all of us. It's very, very important. And Jimmy Carter embodied this, not just to mouth the words, not just to say the right thing, but to live in the right way. And that is so important today. Look, a president is not just a policymaker and a decision maker. A president is a role model for all of us. And it's time we reflected on the kind of role model that Jimmy Carter was, aside from the difficulties of his presidency. And maybe, just maybe, we can begin to transcend the toxic politics of our own time and embrace the kind of positive humanitarian faith that Jimmy Carter represented, which I believe is the best of religious teachings, not just of Christianity, but all of the world's great religions, which isn't negative, which isn't violent, which isn't demeaning and diminishing other people, but respecting and caring for one another and doing good deeds outside of ourselves. That's what Jimmy Carter was all about.
He certainly was, and we're going to learn a lot more. I'm hoping, Dr. Lichtman, that we're going to hear other stories that we've never heard before. Since he's in heaven now, he won't mind if you talk about that time you saw him on the running trail.
I loved every moment of Jimmy Carter's talk when he returned to us. It was one of the most uplifting experiences of my life, and I'm 77 years old.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you for a life well lived, and thank you for sharing that with us here on News Nation. Appreciate your time and the aspiration that you shared there as we remember President Jimmy Carter. Thanks so much for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.